Riding into battle on a mount, the Cavalier is a subclass built around... Wait, this cannot be right. It's a tank? What about all that mounted stuff? Oh, that's just fluff? I mean, okay. Yeah, cool. So, welcome to, surprisingly, one of the best tanks in D&D 5th edition. This subclass isn't actually about riding creatures into battle, it's actually about preventing damage. This guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions. I won't be going over basic subclass information because you can probably read. I've either played or DM'd for all the fighter subclasses, and my opinions almost certainly won't align with the D&D community at large. I will be ranking the subclass based on 5 criteria. I will be scrutinizing subclass features gotten at later levels more intensely, because most players aren't going to make it past 10th level with a character, so my analysis is weighted more towards earlier subclass features. With all that out of the way, let's begin. If you've never played a Cavalier before, let me just get this out of the way. This subclass ain't about riding a mount. I mean, yes, it does have features for that, but you're primarily getting a subclass built around a taunt mechanic. Only one feature is mount dependent, born to saddle. Others just don't care whether you're mounted or not, like Ferocious Charger. Starting at 15th level, you can run down your foes whether you're mounted or not. Most of the other features though are built around other creatures attacking you or you whacking them in response. So the more they attack creatures other than you, the quicker they die. Which, in the design of 5th edition, is really good. Like, I want you to look at this feature real quick. Unwavering Mark. This is a goated taunting feature. This is because it gets you extra attacks. And combat in D&D 5th edition is built around something known as the action economy. Essentially, whichever side has more actions is more likely to win. Even if the creatures are significantly less powerful than you are, the more of them there are and the more actions they bring to a combat, the harder they'll be to beat. And since Unwavering Mark gets you a special bonus action attack on your next turn, while you are just increasing the amount of attacks and actions that you're able to put out into combat. Unwavering Mark forces enemies to deal with you or die. Before 5th level, if you get your Unwavering Mark attack off, it's like you're taking an additional turn. And again, I can't even overstate just how insane this subclass is because of the ridiculous amount of extra attacks you are getting. Unwavering Mark, Hold the Line, and Vigilant Defender all help you get more attacks. Almost half the features in this subclass are based around you attacking more often, which ironically makes you a defensive monster. We've already talked about Unwavering Mark enough. It makes sure that enemies keep away from your friends and attack into you. But Warding Maneuver as well shuts down attacks against your friends, because the two options you get with Warding Maneuver are both fantastic. Either you make an attack against an ally just flat out miss, or you grant resistance to all damage. What? That's insane! This is how you become a tank in D&D 5th edition. Because look, if you're trying to defend the 11 AC wizard versus the ancient dragon, they're pretty much getting hit no matter what. But resistance to all damage? Yeah, that's a tanking ability worth writing home about. I'm telling you, the first time I ran for a Cavalier fighter in D&D 5th edition, I was shocked at just how effective they were at keeping everyone else on the battlefield safe. And really, you do it by just being a bigger problem than everyone else. You are such a pain in the ass to fight against and shift the action economy so much that enemies are just forced for their own safety to attack you. And oh, I almost forgot, you get to ride around with a mount. Yeah, like technically, this is a core concept of this subclass, but you can forget about it with all the insanely good features that are placed around the tanking abilities. So if you want to play a mounted warrior, this is it. This is the subclass. And if you want to play a tank, that's there as well. It's like they took two ideas and fused them into one and just gave you the best of both. You are still effective if you are dismounted. Thankfully, being on a mount or not doesn't really affect how well this subclass operates. But now I think we should really start talking about the concepts that you can get into with this subclass, because again, it's split into two different minds. One aspect of the Cavalier, it's its role as a defender, as the tank. You're a protector of the party, warding off attacks from your friends. Your weapon is as much a shield as anything else your party has. What does your character look like and act like to be this much of a defender? Why is this their fighting style in combat? These are all important questions to ask when you're playing a Cavalier fighter. But then there's the second aspect of your character, which is being a mounted combatant. Why did you get so good at riding your mount? Do you have a deep connection with your mount? What do those interactions with your mount look like outside of combat? Ideally, you should be getting a free party pet with this subclass, and that's a built-in feature of this subclass to bounce off your roleplay. So Cavaliers, do your homework on both aspects of the class. Think about why you are a defender and why you are a mounted combatant. And ideally, if you can fuse those two ideas together somehow, you'll have a super strong character concept that can carry you from level 3 to level 20. But if you're going that far, you might want to multi-class. So let's talk about multi-classing. And if you're thinking, man, I want to multi-class, which class should I? It's Barbarian. You need to look at Barbarian, specifically the Ancestral Guardian, the Zealot, or the Totem subclasses if you're wanting to multi-class. Specifically, I am going to beat the drum for the Ancestral Guardian Barbarian and the Cavalier Fighter multi-class, because it creates one of the most oppressive tanks in all of D&D 5th edition. You can look at your Dungeon Master and say, I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me. The build is 3 levels of a Cavalier Fighter and 6 levels of a Barbarian Ancestral Guardian. You get the feature Ancestral Protectors, which grant disadvantage on attacks against your allies, always really good, and grant resistance to enemy damage. Now, how do you get this ability off? Well, you have to hit a creature, which is something that the Cavalier Fighter does really well. And later on, at 6th level, you're going to get Spirit Shield. And this is going to further expand your area of influence and stop damage from hitting anyone in your party. Plus, it always gives a reaction to use on your turn, so ideally, every single turn with this multiclass, you have your action, your bonus action, and your reaction used. And after all this is said and done, enemies are put into a no-win situation. This whole build just becomes more disgusting if you go fighter 11 levels afterward. If you know that you are going to be in a long-term campaign, if your D&D group usually finishes your campaigns, this is something I highly suggest you looking at. Because going fighter, the final 11 levels, gives you warding maneuver, this time at 13th level, but it completes your already strong build. It grants resistance to enemy damage from enemies that you haven't even hit yet. This is, by far, one of the most disgusting multi-classes I have ever seen. Very importantly for me and my players, it's good at all levels, and it only gets better over time. There's not going to be a point in this multi-class where you're waiting for it to come online. It's just good all the time, and it only gets better over time. Plus, with your bonus action attack from the Cavalier, missing out on the extra attack doesn't feel as impactful. You're still making a lot of attacks, and you're still preventing so much damage anyway. But if Barbarian isn't your cup of tea, might I suggest the Drake Warden Ranger? Because the Drake Warden Ranger is a built-in mount. Therefore, it has amazing synergy with the Cavalier Fighter. And once you get your mount, it really doesn't matter if you level Ranger or Fighter, since both are pretty great options. Ranger is going to get you a little bit more utility and is going to upgrade your mount further, while Fighter is going to make you even more oppressive in combat. But this nicely allows me to slide into some of my dislikes of this subclass. And there are only really 2 things that I have a gripe about with the Cavalier. The first, and maybe the biggest, is that it has no innate mount. It's kinda crazy, but you might struggle to find a mount in some campaigns. I really feel like having a summonable mount would be a huge quality of life fix. Because it's kind of a bummer if you don't have a mount, or your mount dies, or you just can't get something to ride on. In some campaigns I've seen, it's kind of like there's this general tax on a Cavalier fighter, because their mount will die in combat and they'll have to spend X amount of gold to buy a new horse, or a new whatever so that they can continue riding on it. But that might make the subclass a bit too strong, because honestly, I feel like it's misadvertised, and this is my second dislike. Because at the end of the day, there's not a lot in the actual mounted combat department when it comes to the Cavalier fighter. This subclass is built to be a tank. It is meant to taunt the enemies and goad them into attacking you, keeping the rest of your party safe. But that's not widely known, and so when a player looks at the Cavalier, they might just think it's a mounted knight, basically. And that's all it is. So players that would actually really like playing a Cavalier step away, or a player steps in and plays a Cavalier because they're expecting full-on mounted combat, and they're met with one subclass feature that really deals with being a mounted knight. So I think this subclass is in a desperate need of a rebrand. But does that mean that the Cavalier is a bad subclass by any means? No, it's actually a really good one. Let's get to the ratings. 5 categories: roleplay, offensive, defensive, utility, and X Factor, the thing that your subclass does differently from everything else. For roleplay, I'm giving this subclass a 15 out of 20. It gives many different avenues for roleplay, whether to be this tanky defender or a mounted knight or some kind of fusion of the two. But it doesn't advertise itself very well. And so sometimes when building a Cavalier, players can get a little bit confused. But the worthwhile array of character building options that the Cavalier has access to, I think put it firmly at a 15 out of 20. Then we go to the offensive category, and this is certainly a 17 out of 20. The action economy is king in D&D 5th edition. And in-game, a Cavalier firing on all cylinders routinely breaks the action economy at low levels. Not only that, but it completely changes the enemy's offensive game plan. The Cavalier has such a huge impact offensively on the game in combat, but even that is dwarfed by its insane defensive capabilities. And there's only one rating I could give here. The Cavalier is a 20 out of 20 for its defensive gameplay. It is arguably the best tank in all of D&D 5th edition. I think there are arguments to be made by an Oath of Redemption Paladin or an Ancestral Guardian Barbarian, but I don't think any reasonable player or DM can deny that the Cavalier is so good at defending not only itself but its other players. Now though, moving on to utility, and this is a 9 out of 10. You get a bonus proficiency and a bonus language and some benefits to riding a horse, and so that's going to give this subclass a few extra points. But it still falls way short of other fighter subclasses and the utility that they bring to a D&D campaign. I think that this is probably the Cavalier's greatest weakness. In combat, fantastic. In roleplay moments, great. Trying to offer utility on its own, that's where it's lacking. You're gonna have to turn to items or feats to get that done. But then we move towards the X Factor. And this is one that I had a real hard time pinpointing. Because is the X Factor of this subclass its ability to be a mountain combatant, or is the X Factor actually being a tank? And I got to realize, it's both. What separates this class from all the others is that it does two things incredibly well. And for that reason, I had to give it a 19 out of 20. You can engage with one half of the subclass or both, but no matter what, you're going to be getting a unique and interesting character to pilot. And so after adding up everything that the Cavalier fighter has to offer, we come in with a rating of 80 out of 100. This is a really solid fighter subclass that all D&D players should at least consider playing. I think that right now in 2023, as of recording this, it is a forgotten gem. I see Echo Knights and Battle Masters and Rune Knights running around like crazy, but I would love to see more Cavaliers galloping into the battlefield protecting their party. But maybe after this, you've realized Cavalier really isn't your speed, and if that's the case, check out this video right here. This fighter subclass brings a completely new flavor, and thank you for entering the dungeon.